Hello, Year 11, this is Mr. Hinchliffe speaking, and welcome to your first lesson of this final unit of your GCSE. This is Paper 2, and the other half of Paper 2, obviously the other half would have been the American West, but that was cancelled, so this is Paper 2, the other half, and this is the British depth study with 20% of your entire GCSE, and this is looking at Anglo-Saxon and Norman England. Time period we're looking at here is 1060 to 1088, which is very different to the medicine course in the fact that the medicine course is a thematic study. It's broad over 1,000 years. This is the depth study, so it's in a much smaller time period, which means there's a little bit more detail that you have to consider here. I'm just going to quickly talk through the main exam questions here. They are very familiar to you, because some of these are very similar to the Paper 1 questions. So you've got the describe two features, so that is the same on the Paper 1, the Western Front section, worth 4 marks. You've got the explain why question. Again, we keep saying it's good to get good at this question as it is on every single paper, so that's the 12 marker, explain why, the 2 petal paragraphs. And then finally, you've got a judgment question where you're given a choice, you're given a statement, and you have to state whether you agree or disagree, or how far you agree or disagree with that statement. That's out of 16. The only difference, and that's exactly the same concept as the one on medicine, the only difference is you don't get awarded spelling, punctuation and grammar, so it's only out of 16. So that this paper is worth, so you got 16, 12 and 4 all together there. So it's worth 36 marks. You've got around 50-55 minutes to do this paper. So again, it's very similar to the medicine side of things. Okay. What we're going to do to start with on the paper is we're going to start, although the paper begins in 1060, which is the Anglo-Saxon period up to 1066, and then the rest of the course is based on this man here, William of Normandy. Now, you would have covered William when you guys were in Year 7, so you probably already know a little bit about him. But a lot of the course is really focused on him, really, and how the Normans control and take over England from the Anglo-Saxons and how they keep control as well. So, although this lesson is going to start with Anglo-Saxon England, the first thing we want to do really is just look at William himself. So, he's often called William the Bastard. Now, that's not because people don't like him, it's because a bastard is technically an illegitimate person. So that's a person who was born without their parents being married. So he is illegitimate. Now, in the Middle Ages, around this time period, that was seen as a sin. To be born out of wedlock was seen as a sin in the eyes of God. So often, particularly nobles, wouldn't be allowed to inherit anything if they were deemed a bastard. So William is illegitimate. So what we're going to do is just look through some of these sources based on William to see what we can kind of gain from his character. What kind of person is William of Normandy? It's important to know the person behind the whole part of this course. So what I'm going to get you to do is I want you to read through some of these sources. So once you do that, pause the video and then we'll talk through a couple. So just read through and start to think, what can we learn about William as a person? On the booklet, you've got a box here. If you're using the online document, it's a box. If you're using the physical booklet, it's lines. Just to write down a couple of things what you can learn about William. So pause the video now. Okay, so what I'm hoping you've gathered is that William is quite a ruthless person. He is a ruthless leader. I think the best example is during this one here, when he was a duke, so a kind of a leader, a young leader, a duke. So he owned Normandy in northern France, and there were uprisings against him, and he cut off the hands and feet of a lot of the rebels of the town, and it's said that he even catapulted some of the rebels over the town walls, and they quickly surrendered. And that happened a lot during William's early career. He was feared. So he's a ruthless leader. He's also a feared leader as well. There's definitely evidence of him being quite cruel. So we know, when he's marrying his wife Matilda, he dragged her by the hair, until she agreed to marry him. Obviously, it's evidence at Valedon that he's also quite cruel as well. So he's a cruel leader as well. But that's kind of the makeup of a ruler during the Middle Ages. It is a brutal time. It is a hard time to live, and William's early childhood is traumatic. So his father, Robert, was the Duke of Normandy. His mother was a peasant, and when he was 7 or 8, around that time, his father dies. He inherits the dukedom of Normandy, which, as we said, shouldn't probably have happened because he was illegitimate, but he did. And lots of the other Norman nobles didn't like it, and William in his younger days was constantly on the run. He witnessed a lot of his kind of stewards, his guardians, murdered in front of him, and it shows you the example there. One of his guardians was murdered in front of him whilst he was sleeping at the age of 8 years old, and so quite a traumatic experience for William, really. And eventually, as he grew older, he took revenge and he solidified his position as Duke, but those early childhood issues obviously had a lasting effect on him. So he did have a very tough upbringing, which may have then kind of influenced his later life. So that's about William. Here's just an area for you to write down any questions you have about William, and if you do have any questions, you can post them to me, and I can answer any questions you do have on William. So just interesting to know him at first, to introduce him, the main idea of the course. What we're going to do today, though, lesson 1, is we're looking at what England looked like in the year 1060, which is the start of our course. And we're looking at Anglo-Saxon society. Now, the Anglo-Saxons were from northern Germany and Denmark, and they migrated to Britain after the Romans had left in around 410. So they were Germanic, and they migrated to Britain in the 5th century. So they had been in England for around 500, 600 years by this time. So England, and the word England comes from the word Angle. So Angle land is what it was called. That turns into England. Anglo is often a word we use to describe English as well. So this is the England, the original England that we know historically. So what we're going to do is look at the Anglo-Saxons. We're going to look at how their society was run and ruled. And when we say society, we mean a collective of people living together. And we're going to look at how powerful their king was. So they're ruled by a king. Okay, so what we've got then is we've got this diagram. So here are the main groups, social groups, that make up Anglo-Saxon society. So we've got Earls, so just a bit of a strange pronunciation there. So Earl, you've got Earls, kings, peasant, slave, and then thane. So what to do is to read through the little diagram here. So, and then to try and work out, and there's obviously images as well to help you understand who this person might be. So we'll model one together, and then I'm going to get you to go off and try to work out the rest yourself. You've also got here some character cards. So this is to add some extra information as well. But what I'd suggest you do first is work out who's who. So let's have a look at this one here. So it says, had the power to pass laws, make sure they were enforced throughout the country, controlled the production of silver, pennies, used as money, decided when taxation should be paid using a national taxation system. So this person passes laws, they make sure they're enforced, they control the production of money, and they control the taxation system. So this person here, and as you can see, the kind of image gives it away, this is the king. Now, I've put this box here. If you've got a physical copy, you could just write it above, but I didn't have space. So this is the king. Okay. So king's been done. Go through the rest. See if you can work out who the Earls are, the Earls, the peasant, slave, and this word here, which is thane. See if you can work that out. Pause the video, and then we'll come back in a bit. Okay. So hopefully you've gone through. This is quite difficult. I can understand that, but I reckon some of you have probably been able to work out a few. You were probably able to identify that these people here are slaves. So the Anglo-Saxons did have slaves. Slavery did exist, and around 10% of the population, and the population was around 2 million at the time, so around 10% were slaves, quite a long one. These, so vast majority of people are farmers, work on the land. These are peasants. They work on the land of the Lord. So we've done slave, we've done peasant, we've only got a few left. I reckon you were able to work out Earl. Now these are powerful lords who own huge areas of land, and there's going to be some weird terms here because England didn't look like England does now. We're going to talk about that in a sec. But these people are the Earls, and there are usually only 6 of them. You've got the king at the top, and then the Earls. Noble is a term that's often used, but an earldom was their area of land. So that just leaves Earls and thanes. Now, this person here, they made up about 4,000 to 5,000 people. They carried out duties in local communities, such as guarding tax collectors, organising repair of forts and bridges as well. This is the thane. So this is like the local lord, the person who, like a sheriff, that kind of thing. Someone who kind of makes sure that locally things are working well within society. Which must leave this one, last one here, which is the Earl. So the Earl is above the peasants. They are technically free. They have a little bit of land, but they still have to kind of do some services for the king and the earls as well. So that's the makeup of society. Now, what you need to do next is just add a little bit more information. It's really important for you to read through the features of these different members of society, particularly the king and the earls. They're the most important of this society. But the character cards gives us a little bit more information. So if we do one together, and then I'll get you to fill in the information as much as you can. There's a lot of information here. You can't fit it all in. It's just going to be about you paraphrasing a little bit. So we'll look at the king. Okay, so I'll look down here. I'll have a look at the character card. My master decides where I eat, where I work. Well, that's not the king. I'm a member of the local aristocracy. Well, that's not the king, is it? Not local. I have control over the church. I appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury. At any time, I'm able to raise an army for battle. Well, that sounds like the king, but it could be an earl. If I look here, it says, I'm a trusted advisor to the king. Well, that's got to be the earl. So this one has to be the king. So they have control over the church, and they appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury, which some of you will know is the most important church position in England. So for the king, and again, we don't have loads of space, I don't have loads of space. So I'm just going to decrease my font a little bit and write this in. So and write something like controls the church, appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury, and has the ability to raise an army. That's the first one done for you. That's the king done for you. So you need to try find extra information for the earls, the thanes. So we can put that there. The Earls, peasants, and the slaves as well. Okay, so pause the video, look at the character cards, and add in any extra information that you can, and then we'll look back at that in a sec. So pause the video. Okay, so let's have a look then. So the Earls, extra information here for the Earls. You should have written down this one here. So they're trusted advisors to the king, and they're expected to protect the people who live on their land. But the key thing is that they are trusted advisors to the king. And protect their people on their land. The Thanes, as we know, they are, as we said earlier, they're local. So here you go. Look, so they're local aristocracy. And this word basically means nobles. So they're local nobles. Their primary role is to act as a warrior for the king and protect him and when he needs them. So they fight for the king. So so part of the local nobility or aristocracy, you can use either one of those words. You've then got primary role is as a warrior and defender of the king. The Earls, okay, so they're free. Let's have a look. So free, yeah, we know they're free peasants. They can attend courts. They must fight for the king as well. So free man. Can go to a court. Expect to fight for the king. They can bear weapons and arms. Let's have a look at the peasants. So looks like if I do not my job as ordered, I could lose permission to farm the land I work on. I can also be called upon at any time to fight for the king as well. Yeah, so that looks like the peasant, because the last one says my master decides what I eat and where I sleep and who I marry. So I'm going to infer that's a slave. So the peasants. Okay, so can be removed from their land, and again, similar to the Earl, expected to fight for the king. Meaning the slave is the last one. So ultimately, their master dictates their entire life. Were you a slave for life? What does it say? Some, if they had a nice master, would set them free. Some would be set free. Okay, so I'll leave that there so you can pause the video if you need to add that information in. But that is the makeup of Anglo-Saxon society. The king at the top, followed by the earls, followed by the thanes, followed by the Earls, followed by the peasants, and the slaves are at the bottom of society. Okay, so this is important for us to know. So this is a map of what England looked like, approximately looked like in the 1060s at the start of our course. So you can see that it looks very different in makeup to what it is now. England now has lots of small little counties like Essex or Middlesex or Yorkshire. You can't see them here. Essex did exist. So Essex was a little kingdom, and that's what these were. They were originally mini kingdoms. So when the Anglo-Saxons first arrived, when the Romans left, they created these little kingdoms. So there would have been a king of Mercia, a king of Wessex, a king of East Anglia, and a king of Northumbria, and a king of Essex, and then Kent often was one as well. But what happened over the years, hundreds of years, is that eventually these kingdoms unified and became one nation, which was England. But what remained was these weren't kingdoms anymore, these were earldoms. So earldoms are these areas of land controlled by these powerful lords. Wessex, which was in the south and the southwest, was the most prosperous and most powerful earldom out of all of them. So there was lots of rich farmland. So whoever was the Earl of Wessex was a very, very powerful man. And in 1060, that man is Earl Godwin. His son would be Harold Godwin's son, who you might remember from year 7. So then you've got an Earl of Mercia as well, which was huge, and Northumbria, which was really big as well. So it's just really important to know that the Earls hold lots of land. So that is their land. So the Earl of Northumbria owned all of that bit of yellow. The Earl of Mercia owned all of that bit of green, huge parts of the country. So the Earls were extremely, extremely powerful. Now the Godwin family happened to rule over some of these earldoms. So you can see here that Northumbria was Tostig, so that was the son of Godwin, was the Earl of Northumbria. Harold became the Earl of Wessex. They also had a brother who was the Earl of East Anglia as well. So the Godwin family were very powerful, and we're going to come back to them in a few lessons' time. There is a little extension here if you want to draw a diagram to represent Anglo-Saxon England. If you're going to do that, I recommend you do that in the shape of a triangle. If you are going to do it, it's quite a good way to show the hierarchy. And you might just have the king at the top and whatnot. Leave the lesson summary for now. We'll come back to it at the end. This is the last activity we're looking at here. So we need to know who has power and who has influence in England in the 1060s in Anglo-Saxon society. So to have power over something is obviously to have control. You're in charge, you're the leader. To have influence, though, is not necessarily having power, but you dictate decisions. You are able to change the way that someone thinks. So it's really important to know who has what. So what I suggest you do is you highlight these two. So power and influence. And as you read through, it's just reading through what the main people do here. So we'll look at the king here. So in Anglo-Saxon thinking, the king is appointed by God. He acts as Christ's representative on earth. So he's very powerful with the church. He's believed to be chosen by God. His role is to protect England from attack. He makes laws to maintain the safety and security at home. He's the most powerful person in the country. He owns vast wealth from the land he owned and the taxes raised on his behalf. Everybody owed him loyalty and service. Every boy, when they reached 12 years of age, had to swear an oath to be faithful to the king. He had the ability to raise an army, and he granted land to faithful followers. King Edward was not as powerful as previous kings, though. So King Edward was the king at the time, King Edward the Confessor, and he faced threat from his power from Earl Godwin of Wessex. Wessex was the richest kingdom in England, and Godwin owned them so much land as they were rich as the king. Earl Godwin used his power to influence the king and put pressure on him to do things. So we've got examples of power and influence here. So the main power, the king's appointed by God to act as Christ's representative on earth. That gives him lots of power because we know that people are very religious at this time. He's the most powerful person in the country. He owns vast wealth from the taxes and land that he owns. Everyone owed him loyalty and service. That's power. People at the age of 12 had to swear an oath of loyalty to him. Power. Ability to raise an army. Power. But King Edward was not as powerful as previous kings. He faced a threat from Earl Godwin. Wessex was the richest earldom, and Earl Godwin could use his power to influence the king. So this is where you've got and put pressure on him to do things his way. So sometimes the earls could put pressure and influence the king. So what you want to do is you want to do the same thing for the other features. You've got the earls, the church, the king, and then you've got a new thing that we've not come across yet, which is called the Witan. Now this is a council. So a council that meets and it's made up of earls and the church, and the whole point is they are there to advise the king, only advise the king. If the king died, the Witan would decide who would be the next king. So in Anglo-Saxon society, they didn't always necessarily have the next child as king, the next son. It was who was the best suited to be king. So go through the rest of them, identify power and influence. But at the same time, what you want to do here is you want to connect arrows to explain the relationship. So here it says the Earls influence the Witan with decision making. What I would say definitely here is that the king definitely has power over the church. So I'm just going to use one of these arrows here just to kind of represent that. I'm going to use a text box. And say something like, as God's representative on earth, the king would have a lot of power and influence over the church. We know that he picks the Archbishop of Canterbury. And that would give the king great influence because he's going to basically decide who controls and runs the church. So read through, find evidence of power, find evidence of influence, and then try to link an arrow going to each of them to see who has power and who has influence over each other. Okay, off you go. Pause the video. Okay, so this example here, I haven't highlighted all the information within, but please make sure you do that. Please make sure you read and you understand who is who here. But I've just got a few examples here from earlier. So kind of so due to the importance of religion, the view of the church would have a sway of influence over the king. Edward the Confessor was very pious. So that's my other way. That's the other way I've said that the church are having influence over the king. The church have influence over the Witan because prominent church members are on the Witan, on this council, like the Archbishop of Canterbury. I've said, though, that the Witan influences the king's decisions, but it goes both ways, and the king has power over the Witan. He decides when it meets, and ultimately the king makes the final decisions. And finally, the king actually owns, and this is a good stat for you that you'll learn later in the course, but the king owns 30% of the land. He makes the laws. He ultimately does have power over the earls, and they have to be loyal to him. As we know from the other example, people like Earl Godwin did have influence over Edward as well. So I'll just leave that there so you can pause the video if you want to write down anything that you didn't get, but you should see that ultimately the king has power, but there's a lot of influence over him as well. Okay, so the last thing for the lesson is to write the lesson summary. So there's obviously a box available for you there. So Anglo-Saxon society was based on power and status. The king was at the top. The earls below him were also very powerful, and there were usually around 6 earls. The Witan was the main council that helped the king make key decisions. It's made up of the earls and powerful churchmen such as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Finally, a little bit lower down, the Thanes ruled local society that was made up of the ceorls, peasants and slaves. Around 70% of Anglo-Saxons were farmers who worked on the land belonging to a lord. So make sure you write down that lesson summary. Make sure that you either submit this online document via the Teams or take a photo of your work if you're doing it in the physical booklet, and please upload that and send that to your teacher. Hopefully the video was helpful. Don't hesitate to email if you have any questions about any part of it. Okay, thank you 11. See you soon.